Welcome. The Farmhouse Museum on Iowa State University's campus brings you the virtual program, Why Do Manners Matter? The Emily Post Institute on Business Etiquette. Great-great-grandson of author, advocate, and etiquette professional Emily Post, our program presenter is Daniel Post Senning. He is the co-author of the 19th edition on Emily Post's etiquette, co-author of Manners in a Digital World, and podcaster of Awesome Etiquette. And he presents this program tonight on business etiquette directed towards emerging professionals. This pre-recorded program will be posted on University Museum's YouTube channel through December 5th. The two Emily Post Institute programs this semester are generously funded by Dr. Chad E. Harris, a 2001 graduate from Iowa State with a BA. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, and welcome to Why Do Manners Matter, a professional etiquette talk done for the Iowa State University Museums. My name is Daniel Post Senning, and I'm an author and spokesperson for the Emily Post Institute. Emily Post wrote her original book of etiquette in 1922, over 100 years ago, and the Emily Post Institute was founded by Emily and her son to continue the updating of the book that she originally published and had gone through 11 editions in her lifetime, but also to continue to promote etiquette and civility in America. Emily was my great-great-grandmother. The Emily Post Institute is a 5-generation family business. And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about Emily herself and the work that we do at the Emily Post Institute, but I like to weave that information into our talk as we go along. We have a lot of material to cover today. We're going to be working from a PowerPoint deck, and I'm going to start off by sharing that with you. And we're just going to get going. And I'm really looking forward to all of the ground that we have to cover. For anybody that's interested in learning more or following up on today's talk, you're welcome to visit us at emilypost.com. There are lots of ways to get in touch with the Institute online. So without further ado, let's begin. Now, I really just like to start off by welcoming you, even in a virtual format. It is an honor and a privilege to get to spend some time with you today talking about etiquette. And to me, it is a topic that is near and dear. And I'm hoping that by the end of our talk that there will be some new ways for you to connect with the material. And who knows, maybe we'll have picked up an actionable skill or two along the way that will have a material benefit moving forward. I also think it's important to share an agenda so that you have some idea of what to expect from the time that we're going to spend together. We're going to start off by defining some concepts and some terms. We're going to talk about etiquette as a combination of manners and principles. We're then going to move on to talking about why it's important and why it's important particularly for business, for professionals, and in professional situations. Our topic focus is then going to narrow some. We're going to start to look at more specific manners for professionals, and we're going to move through the arc of a relationship. We're going to start with self-assessment. That's looking at image and attire and personal brand. We're then going to move through the story of a relationship through business social experiences where we are first introduced to people, where we have opportunities to first meet. That's going to be self-introductions, greetings, introducing people to each other. We're then going to look at some conversation skills, how that introduction is drawn out, how it develops into a communication, and ultimately how that communication can develop into a relationship when it's extended through time. So we're going to look at written communication, communication that happens via email, on smartphones, and even a little bit over social media. We're then going to conclude the talk with a little tutorial on thank you and follow-up note writing and a call to action that I like to call the 24/7 professional. So without further ado, I like to start just about every talk that I give with some version of a word association game. If I were to put the word etiquette on the screen in front of you, and I were to ask you, what's the first thought that pops into your mind? Go ahead and let that thought emerge. I'm curious. I have done this, a version of this exercise in front of hundreds of live audiences, many thousands of people. And it is always a delight for me to hear what it is that people most closely associate with a concept like etiquette, which is oftentimes poorly defined for people. Now, I will tell you that it's actually remarkably consistent, the types of answers that I hear when I play this game. And it really almost doesn't matter which industry I'm training in or what level of a business I'm training at. I almost always hear examples of good manners, and they're often very similar. Something about using the correct fork or setting the table properly, but also things like holding a door for someone or offering someone a seat on a crowded bus or train. Examples of good manners, examples of people taking care with each other, and examples of courtesies that we can see in each other. I will also oftentimes hear the word respect. And it's important to me to acknowledge this, that for many people, the association with etiquette is about the feeling of the experience, whether it's something that they witness between others or whether it's something that they've experienced themselves. Now, if I keep pushing, and I like to, I will often start to hear people tiptoe up to a line where they have very negative associations with the word etiquette. Words like stuffy, old-fashioned, outdated, even classist or elitist or judgmental are also things that people often think about when they think about the word etiquette. It is really remarkable to me that the same word can make one person think about respect and showing respect or feeling respected, and someone else feel like they are potentially going to be judged or excluded or feel uncomfortable or out of place in a situation. Now, I'll tell you the third area where a lot of people have very immediate associations with the word etiquette is, for some people, it's a very personal connection. Some people will think about their mother or a grandparent or maybe a particular mentor who initiated them into an experience that was really valuable or meaningful or significant. So for many people, when they think about the word etiquette, they're thinking about a very significant person in their life, someone that they're incredibly close to, someone that they admire. Now, for me, when I think about the word etiquette, I think about Emily Post. And I want to introduce you to my great great grandmother. Now, this is Emily, quite a bit younger than most people would picture her. We did a brand study in cooperation with our publisher a few years ago and discovered that most people think Emily Post is still alive and about 10 years older than they are. That she's some sort of authority on etiquette. People have that pretty firmly lodged in their brains. But they also think that maybe she's Miss Manners, maybe she's writing an advice column today. So I like to start off by introducing people to the real Emily Post, a historical figure who was born in the heart of the Victorian age, grew up in that time, but then wrote about etiquette for a very modern audience in 1922 and afterwards. She was largely responsible for translating a lot of those manners from the Gilded or Victorian age and era into the modern world, the world that people found themselves living in after the Great War. Now, Emily was also an indefatigable spirit. She was a character in her own right. She wrote romance novels. She wrote a book called By Motor to the Golden Gate about a cross-country road trip that she took in 1916, at the time when there were very few paved roads west of the Mississippi. She undertook this adventure, and it drew her into nonfiction writing out of the world of romance novels that she initially wrote in. When she was asked to write a book about etiquette, she replied that she wasn't interested, that the topic was relatively simple, that it could all be reduced to a few basic principles, and she didn't have much to say on the topic. Well, the editors persisted. She relented, turned in a manuscript over 400 pages long that has been in print ever since, that they literally could not print fast enough when she first wrote it. It was so in demand. The type of celebrity that Emily attained almost overnight is hard to imagine for a modern or contemporary audience. Maybe today we might think of the Kardashians, maybe 10 or 15 years ago we would think of Oprah Winfrey, but Emily Post was that kind of celebrity figure in her day. She was the arbiter of social standards for generations of Americans. Now, that work was important. Life magazine called her the second most influential woman of the 20th century, right after Eleanor Roosevelt. But I think there was something to her initial response to the topic of etiquette, her idea that it was relatively simple, that it could all be reduced to a few basic principles if you thought about it as she did. Now, after she had a very successful and long career writing about etiquette, Emily delivered her thoughts on the topic to a reporter who came to visit her at her home in retirement in Martha's Vineyard. This is Emily in a picture, I think the way more people would imagine her, very maternal, with her great grandchildren sitting in her lap in the garden of that house in Martha's Vineyard, where she told a reporter, whenever two people come together and their behavior affects one another, you have etiquette. Etiquette is not some rigid code of manners. It's simply how persons' lives touch one another. I think this is incredibly good news. I think that it is one of the most important things that we can keep in mind as we proceed through the rest of our time together today, as we continue to think about etiquette and the ways that we can leverage it and use it in professional circumstances and situations. Ultimately, what etiquette is about how our behavior impacts and affects the people around us. We are all connected to one another in some way. We live in community. We are born helpless in this world. None of us would survive alone. We need each other. This is the point in the talk where I ask you to take just a minute and to think about the people in your life that matter to you. Just one or two. Think about the people that you value, the relationships that give you a feeling of connection, that give you a feeling of purpose, that draw you into the world in ways that are meaningful. Now, it could be a parent, it could be a child, it could be a relative, a close friend, a colleague. We are going to attempt to answer the question of why etiquette matters, why it's important. And we're going to look at a lot of good answers to that question. But the best answer to that question is one that you can provide yourself. If you can keep that picture in your mind of the person or the people that matter most to you, that is why etiquette matters. How we behave and how our behavior impacts those people and our relationships with them is ultimately what etiquette is all about. And I can talk about the impacts on workplaces. I can talk about individual improvement and how important it is as a part of career development. But ultimately, it's the people in our lives that matter to us that really are the reason that etiquette is so important. And I think that it's important that you provide that answer for yourself, and that answer comes from some genuine reflection and a desire for genuine connection and high quality connection with the people around us. Now, that's the good news. There's also some bad news as we step away from Emily Post and we talk about what it looks like when we don't have etiquette, in the absence of etiquette. Well, AP Ipsos did a poll a few years ago about rudeness in America or incivility in America. They asked a broad and statistically relevant audience, are Americans ruder today than they were 20 or 30 years ago? Now, if I were to ask you that question, no need to put your hand in the air, but would your hand be going up? I'm going to tell you that you're not alone. About 70% of people are going to agree with that sentiment. I'm also going to tell you that etiquette is a moving target, that manners change and evolve. Certain manners lose their utility and fall out of fashion. Other manners emerge in response to changing environments and situations. And it is not uncommon for a person to witness or watch the changes that occur in manners over the course of a lifetime and think that the state of manners are in decline. One of the advantages of a family business that's been writing and thinking about etiquette 4 or 5 generations is that we witness the generational renewal of this. And we can say with some confidence that this is a common perception in every generation in some form or another. Now, perhaps the technological shift that we're undergoing as a species is putting stresses on our social systems. Maybe the changes that today's generation is facing are greater than some of the challenges that previous generations have faced and are providing particular challenges and stresses to our social systems that are difficult or hard to overcome. AP Ipsos dug a little deeper. They asked, on a frequent or occasional basis, do you encounter people using their cell phones rudely? So this newly ubiquitous infinite connectivity that we all experience, is it resulting in people experiencing rude behavior more frequently? Well, if you were to answer this question in the affirmative, you're in even better company, because close to 90% of people are going to say they've experienced this kind of rudeness recently or frequently. Now, I'm a big fan of builds and slides. I like to develop my material so that one thing builds on top of another. There's room here for one more question. It's the follow-up question that was asked in this poll. And if you are playing the game that I often like to play and you're imagining what that question might be, you might have already asked, well, have you used your cell phone in a loud or annoying manner? How many people are gonna put that little hand up now? How many of you listening to this talk are saying to yourself, "Oh boy, yeah, that's me. I do that. I do my best, but really, I know that I fail, and that ultimately I end up treating people in ways or behaving with my devices in ways that other people perceive as rude." Well, if you weren't as eager to put your hand in the air, but with a little reflection, you started to think about it, you could join the under 10% of people that were willing to cop to this kind of behavior themselves. So, is 8% of the population responsible for the bad behavior that 89% is experiencing? I don't think so. I don't think it's likely. I don't think it's plausible. It's possible. It could be true that there are a few egregious actors that are so bad they're impacting everyone else, but I think that there is likely a different story that these numbers are telling us. If you were to ask yourself, what are some explanations? What are some reasons that you might posit that would explain why it's true that 89% of the public will say we've experienced rude behavior at the hands of someone using a cell phone, but only 8% of the public will say, oh, it's likely that I have done that recently. Well, the obvious answer is that there's a question of perspective that's fundamentally important, that it's easier to see rudeness in others than it is in ourselves. We just don't have the same context for understanding someone else's actions that we have for understanding our own. It's also true that the ways that we see and perceive the world, we are more likely to notice things that are potentially threatening, dangerous, or negatively impact us. So it's also true that our attention will be drawn to moments where social cohesion is not in play and not functioning because it feels disruptive and we notice it. But it is fundamentally easier to excuse our own bad behavior because we understand the good intentions or the context behind it, whereas we're only seeing the impact when we see it in others. There is a question of perspective that's really important here. There's also a question of intention that's really important here. And this is a subtler point, but I think it's maybe the one of the most important points that we can make in a talk about business etiquette and professionalism, and that's that rudeness isn't always intentional. I think that the vast majority of people watching this talk right now did not wake up this morning and say to themselves, I'm going to go make someone's day a little worse today. I'm going to treat someone badly. They're going to feel disrespected. They're going to have a harder time focusing or connecting with the people around them. It's just not the way most of us are programmed. I like to think that people are of goodwill and good intent. I like to assume that until it's been proven otherwise. Now, this is an important allowance to give others because I think that it is also an important allowance to give ourselves in that it allows us to look at ourselves and look at the behaviors and the places where we could make some improvement, or maybe where there are impacts or repercussions that are negative that we aren't aware of or aren't considering as much as we should. I think this is where etiquette starts to become an incredibly powerful tool. When you think about the word association and someone who thinks of etiquette as judgmental or elitist, that's usually when it's been used to judge or assess them. Etiquette becomes functionally almost useless or much less useful when you're using it to judge or assess someone else's behavior. Why? Because you usually don't have the standing to address it, and you almost always don't have the standing to improve or correct it. And you definitely or certainly not in the moment that it happens. When you're using etiquette as a tool for self-reflection and self-improvement, it becomes incredibly powerful. When you're using etiquette as a way to assess yourself and your own behaviors and to use that as a lens for decision making, it starts to become potentially transformative in terms of the impact that it can have on your relationships with other people. So etiquette as a tool for self-improvement, self-reflection is incredibly powerful. Used to judge or assess others or to issue rulings on other people, it not only starts to become functionally as useful, it actually starts to work against some of the outcomes that we would like from really good etiquette, where people are made to feel comfortable, at ease, connected, and integrated or well fit with the people around them. So if we have a broad idea of etiquette, that it's about social cohesion, that it's about caring for others, it's about thinking about our own behaviors in relation to the impacts that they have on others, we've started to have a pretty powerful concept for etiquette before we've talked about a single rule or manners expectation. Now, I want to leave you with three goals. And these are the same three goals that I will reiterate at the end of our talk, and I like to give them to you right at the beginning. If you can think before you act, and in particular, think about other people. So if you apply your rational and cognitive thinking skills, not just to the task in front of you, but to the people around you as well, you're going to be in great shape. That's step one. Step two is that you then make choices that build or grow relationships. There are lots of different ways to do the same thing. How we do something really matters. And the choices that we make about how we do something are fundamentally important. There are lots of good reasons to make those kinds of choices. Something is faster, something is cheaper, something is more familiar, something is being done the way it's been done before. Well, you can also make a choice to do something because it improves or benefits relationships. And when we're talking about etiquette and using it as a lens to assess our behavior, that's the framework that we want to use. Now, sometimes cost is going to be a deciding factor. Sometimes there are going to be very practical concerns that are going to set the parameters for your decision making. But for this particular application, we're going to be thinking about making choices that build or grow relationships. And finally, we're going to do it sincerely. We're going to operate not only from a place of honesty and integrity, but also from a place of sincerity and authenticity. Now, I can give you an example of sincerity and insincerity and how they can transform the same action. Oh, please, is he really going to tell me to think before I act? Please, I implore you, think before you act. It can save you a lot of trouble. So a lot of us are familiar with the idea that please is a magic word. It's going to pop up in our communication section of today's talk, but it's not please itself that's magic. If you were a group of 5-year-olds and I was teaching this class with my mother, I would say the magic's in you. It comes from your sincerity. It comes from your authenticity. Please, I implore you. Sarcastically, oh, please. A sarcastic or insincere please can be dismissive, can tear down a relationship, can be wielded almost as a weapon. Whereas a sincere, authentic, genuine please turns a demand into a request. It acknowledges someone else's agency in a situation, and their ultimate decision making. You're asking them something. Now, please is a magic word. It is powerful. It is transformative when it is paired with your own sincerity. Ultimately, the magic's in you. Think before you act, make choices that build relationships, do it sincerely. You're going to be in great, great shape. Now, we use a little etiquette equation at the Emily Post Institute. I've kind of been alluding to it a little bit, but I want to be very explicit with you and share it with you. We talk about etiquette as a combination of manners and principles. Now, manners I've alluded to several times already. They're the specific behavioral expectations that we have of ourselves or others in a given social situation. As I've said already, manners change and evolve over time. They vary from one household to another, from one company to another, from one country to another, even from one region of a country to another. Manners can be very, very culturally specific. It doesn't mean that they're not important. They tell us what to expect of ourselves and what to expect of others in a given situation. They're oftentimes a shorthand for very important and complicated social concepts and agreements. The second part of the manners equation are the principles. And the principles are the core values that the manners are meant to express or illustrate. They also provide us guidelines for our actions when we find ourselves trying to resolve a difficult situation where there isn't a particular manner that applies, or when we're trying to resolve a situation where maybe manners are in conflict with one another. So we have manners that are specific behavioral expectations and principles that are the values or the core ideas that are expressed by those manners. And you don't have etiquette without a combination of the two. Now, this is the elementary school version. Because this is a talk for a collegiate audience, I will offer you my first assignment for the day, which is send me an email with the calculus equation that etiquette equals manners derived from core principles. So what are those core principles? What are the principles that we've used at the Emily Post Institute for 100 years and 5 generations to assess manners and guide us as manners come and go? The principles that we've identified as being fundamentally important are consideration, respect, and honesty. Now, consideration is that thinking, but particularly that thinking about others, the capacity to connect on an emotional level, to empathize with the people around us, as well as be aware of them. So, consideration as we start to build out the ideas, both the awareness of others, but also the awareness of and connection to others. Now, for respect, I like a working definition of respect that's about recognizing the worth and value in things. So that's others, recognizing the worth and value of others, but it's also about self respect, recognizing the worth and value of yourself, as well as the things around us that are also deserving of respect. If we're talking about a children's etiquette program, we might be talking about shared public spaces, things like taking care of your locker. For grown-ups, I like to talk about complex systems theory and the idea that we have inherited social systems that are incredibly complex, that support all of us in ways that are almost impossible to imagine. And it is in some ways our responsibility to steward these structures and systems, that we might have a responsibility to improve them, to make them work better, but that we also have a responsibility to take care of them, because if they collapse completely, it's a core tenet of complex systems theory that once a system reaches a certain level of complexity, you can't always put it back together again. So it's important to have respect both for others, self, but also things, the traditions that have brought us to the point that we are today. And this is one of the ways that we can think about tradition and the importance of tradition within the world of etiquette. Honesty is our third and final core principle of etiquette. And as we've already talked about, it's not just standards of truth and truth telling, but it's also standards of sincerity and authenticity in terms of how you represent yourself and how you express yourself. Now, these principles are very abstract concepts, and they can be difficult to define. We could spend a lot of time talking about each one of them, but what I'm really particularly interested in is how these become explicit and recognizable attributes, part of our behavior, or maybe in business situations, part of organizational culture. We get this by bringing our etiquette into action. And if you think about the 3 goals that we just talked about, they relate very directly to the core principles of good etiquette. You show that consideration for others by thinking about them before you act. You show that you recognize their value as well as the value of the relationship by making choices that build or grow those relationships. And you demonstrate your honesty and your trustworthiness through the sincerity and authenticity of your behavior. Think before you act, make choices that build relationships, do it sincerely. All of a sudden, you're demonstrating consideration, respect, and honesty, values that are oftentimes embedded or built into organizational mission and value statements, but that can be very hard to put into action and to make action plans that really allow organizations to take those values and mission statements and make them part of the business culture that other stakeholders get to interact with. Again, the reminder: think before you act, make choices that build or grow relationships, do it sincerely. Now, why is this important? Why business etiquette in particular? Well, my pitch for you is twofold: that it maximizes the opportunity both for individual success and organizational success. I want to start by talking to each and every person watching this as an individual. Etiquette, and particularly professional etiquette, can be a differentiator. We live in an increasingly informal, casual, complex world, and there are opportunities for distinction all around us. It takes relatively little today to set yourself apart from the rest of the crowd if you are intentional about how you conduct yourself, and you are intentional about building and growing relationships in ways that are recognizable to others. We live in a world that values individual autonomy and freedom and action. I work and live in Vermont, a state that's known for its rugged individualism. But it is also true that none of us can live alone, that we all live in community, and the degree to which we can make our valuing of relationships and community and groups and organizations an explicit and recognizable part of our behavior is just an incredible opportunity. Now, I do the intern hiring at the Emily Post Institute. We have a checklist that talks about good etiquette behaviors for in-person interviews. The last item on that checklist is send a handwritten thank you note if someone takes the time to interview you in person for an opportunity. It's an explicit expectation defined on our website. I will tell you that about 1 out of every 3 people that I interview at the Emily Post Institute sends a thank you note. We have very similar applicants from the same sororities and fraternities at the same schools. There is not a lot to differentiate between our internship candidates within a semester or year to year. That thank you note is a really easy way for 1 of 3 applicants to pretty much guarantee that they're going to get 1 of 2 spots. Now, if someone else is more qualified, it's not going to have you jump ahead of them in the line, but it is a really, really simple opportunity to differentiate yourself from other qualified candidates. Now, if I've got 3 qualified candidates, 1 thank you note in hand and 2 jobs, I've got 1 spot filled and 1 question mark in my mind. It is that simple, it is that immediate, it is that direct, it is powerful, and is potentially transformational. The opportunities for distinction are all around us. The second tip is that these are not obligations. It's one of the things that makes it so powerful to choose to do it. I will not come check up on you next month, in 3 months, 6 months, a year to see if you have either improved your thank you note writing practice or tried writing a thank you note in a professional context for the first time. But I will guarantee you that if you make the choice to do it, it will have a positive impact on that relationship. We can talk about the data on the impact of thank you and follow-up notes, particularly handwritten ones, but it's one of the few places where I can offer you almost a guarantee that it will have a positive impact on the relationship. And it's not enough, and it's not it's optional. It's not something where you are likely to get docked by your supervisor for not doing it, or if you fail to do it after your next interview, the person who interviewed you is not going to come check in and say, hey, I got a thank you note from the other person, but not from you. And that was the thing that kind of nudged them over just a little bit. In some ways, it's precisely because they're not required that they're such powerful choices to make. And because they're choices that say, I'm thinking about you and I care about you and I care about other people, it becomes even more powerful to make those choices. The other tip is that it's much easier to do if you can see it as an opportunity and not as an obligation. If you say to yourself, as I move to the next slide, oh boy, do I have to write thank you notes now? It gets harder to do. If you say to yourself, boy, I had never thought about it that way. If I write 1 thank you note in the next 6 months, it could have a real impact on my professional relationship with that person. All of a sudden, it gets easier to do. The more you can see any of the etiquette or manners expectations that we're talking about as opportunities, the less you can approach them as obligations. Not only the more powerful they're going to be, the better they're going to work for you, the easier they're going to be to do. Now, let's talk a little bit about organizational costs. I want to, big picture, direct you to the work of a woman named Christine Porath. She's an incredible academic researcher who also does a very good job of translating that academic research so that it's understandable to a lay business audience or to a business audience. One of the best studies that they did was summarized in a book called The Cost of Bad Behavior that I can't recommend highly enough, where they looked at the impacts that incivility and rudeness have on organizations and have on individuals in the workplace. They looked at examples of incivility that someone could very specifically identify. One of the things I liked about this study is that in order for incident of incivility to be considered within the study, someone had to be able to describe it, talk about when it happened and the impact that it had on them. So the incidence of incivility is actually probably much higher than what I'm about to share with you. Out of all of the people they interviewed, over half had experienced some type of rudeness in the workplace in the last year. Now, how many of those people lost work time avoiding the instigator? Maybe a busy supervisor that didn't say hi in the morning or never said hi in the morning, who they would avoid until lunch or till they had coffee. Something like 30% of people. How many lost work time worrying? Sat down at their desk and said, boy, is that person mad at me today? They never say hi. Do they not like me? Something like 50% of people experience that kind of stress at work based on rude behavior. How many intentionally decrease their work effort and we're willing to talk about it? Well, if they can't even say hi to me in the morning, we'll see when I get to work on that report, or I'll get to that when they get to me. 22%. Don't worry, these numbers weren't going to just keep growing and growing and growing, but that's still a really high number. People that were willing to admit they intentionally decreased their work effort based on the way they were being treated actually left their job 12%. I almost didn't believe this number the first time I saw it. I said, it's too high. There's no way. Then I started to do the math in my head. Well, 12% of the half that experienced incivility represents maybe about 6% turnover, and about 5% turnover in an organization is not an unreasonably high number. What do you think is the number one reason people give for leaving a place of employment besides salary or pay? I didn't feel respected or appreciated. It's about the way people are treated in the workplace. What does it cost to replace a salaried individual? About twice an annual salary. Now, you can look at some of these other impacts, the intentionally decreased work effort, the lost work time worrying, lost work time through avoidance, and assign values to that and start to calculate the cost of incivility. You can estimate the total number of incidents of incivility, and some very large global corporations have used this data as the basis for civility initiatives that are estimated to save millions of dollars annually by addressing behaviors that, while difficult to pinpoint, identify, and address socially, cost almost nothing to address once you've done that work, once you've figured out how to work on those particular issues. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, boy, I'm really good at my job, this doesn't apply to me, or boy, the team that I supervise could really use some of this information. Well, the bad news is that the instigator is likely to be a supervisor, a boss, a leader, or a worker with perceived value talent. If you're thinking to yourself, I'm really good at my job, this doesn't apply to me. Well, that's one of those situations where that one finger pointing at someone else leaves three fingers pointing right back at you. Etiquette is an incredibly powerful tool when used as a tool for self-reflection and self-improvement. And this is one of the places where I really like to remind everyone of that. There are things that you can do to lead on civility, either as a team member or as someone in a leadership position, or as someone who's just really good at your job and wants to model good behaviors on top of that excellent work. What can you do to lead on civility? Well, you start by leading by example. We used to tell parents, model the behavior that you want to see in your children, but we stopped using that language because you can't just model behaviors. You can't just put them on and take them off again. People are watching you all the time. They're processing everything that you do, both consciously and pre-consciously. And it's important that you actually embody and embrace these principles yourself. You have to lead by example and not just put those behaviors on, but really use them to guide you at all times. Communicate positively and carefully. It's important that your internal life is well organized, that you care about these things, but it's also important that you're able to talk about them and you're able to share about them. That includes expectations for the future. If you're looking to institute change, it's really important that you don't look to the past and try to cast judgment or assess how the damage has happened. If we're talking about changing behaviors and we're talking about changing organizational culture, you really want to look for transitional moments, places and times where you can clarify expectations for the future. Once you've done that, then you can enforce the standards in your places of work. Once you have led by example, communicated clearly and carefully and positively, and you've also then clarified expectations moving forward, then it's important to have standards and to have accountability and to be willing to talk to people about times and situations where things aren't working, remembering that oftentimes people aren't aware of their own root behavior, that oftentimes this is a process first of bringing attention to it and then working to resolve the issue. Ultimately, embrace the goals, think before you act, make choices that build relationships, do it sincerely as a general approach to difficult situations and decision making, no matter what situations you find yourself in. So that's our broad talk about etiquette, defining core principles that we can use to guide us when particular manners don't apply, as well as the manners themselves, those particular and specific behaviors that we can expect of ourselves and others in certain situations. And having talked some about the principles, I now want to transition our focus and spend a little bit more time on manners. Now, we used to talk about image and attire because there was a very standardized professional dress that if you were aware of, you could decide to participate in, and you were hitting all your marks. We live in a more complicated world today where we're asked to make many more choices. And oftentimes, when we're thinking about presentation and how others see us, it's important to think about branding. Now, I'm not a brand expert, but I do know that brand is storytelling, that we establish emotional connection to things through narrative and through story. So that ultimately branding is a kind of storytelling. And I want to encourage you to think about your brand story. And your brand story is not long, it's quick, it's about a sentence. Oh, she was great to work with. She was so smart and energetic and just brought life to the whole project. That's it. That's your brand story. I want you to think about an image assessment exercise that you can do right now. And that's, I want you to describe yourself using 3 words. And I know it's difficult. I know that we're all complicated and interesting people. It's the limitation in many ways that I think makes this exercise so powerful. You want to limit yourself to 3 words. If you were to look for 3 key attributes that would honestly describe you, what would they be? Now, I'm not talking about the perfect you once you've done all the good work that I know we're all going to do, and the you that's going to emerge in a week or 3 months or a year from now, but you as you sit today, what are 3 words that accurately describe you, that you would be willing to use to build into a sentence? Well, I'm tough, I'm hardworking, I'm hard to get to know. I'm smart, I'm good looking, I'm funny. It can be anything. There can be they can be positive, they can be negative, there can be good humor, they can be serious. It's not a value choice here. We're trying to be as honest and accurate as possible. This is a micro version of an image assessment exercise that a professional image consultant would do with you. We used to work with the Association of Image Consultants International. We would do executive coaching and image consulting. And one of the first things that an image consultant does with an executive is they do an image assessment. And they try to look at you as you stand, as you are when they walk into the room, so that they've got a baseline, a place to work from, and somewhere to grow from. The second thing that image consultant's going to do is put together an image team. And that's a group of people that are going to provide multiple perspectives on someone's image, multiple external perspectives. Now, I want you to think about who you could ask to be on your image team. So this is a micro version of image consulting team building. And for bonus points, I want you to think about people that know you in slightly different capacities that you'd be willing to ask you to that you'd be willing to ask to help you do a little image exercise yourself. So if you choose your 3 closest friends, they're going to give you 3 very similar assessments of your image. But if you choose someone you're very close to, that could be a spouse, a partner, a best friend, a very close work colleague, someone who knows you in a professional capacity, and then someone who knows you from a bit of a distance. So maybe that's someone you work with, but they're at a neighboring office. Maybe that's a professor that teaches a seminar class that you see once a week instead of a lab class that you're at 3 days a week. Someone who you interact with, but you don't necessarily see or interact with on a daily basis. The idea here is to get people that know you in slightly different capacities. Now, this is where I'm going to give you your first homework assignment of the talk, and you can probably guess what it is. You're going to take each of the 3 people that you've thought about who you could ask to be part of your image team. You're going to ask each of them to write down 3 words that they would use to accurately describe you to someone else. So you ask those people to write down the 3 words they would use to describe you to someone they were recommending you to, or to a friend they were introducing you to, or to a family member they were telling about you. This is one of those exercises where I think the first thing that people think about is, oh boy, it might be useful, and that it could reveal that other people are seeing things that I don't see. And if you think you're funny, but nobody else thinks you're funny, it's probably worth knowing that, and you want to be careful about the kind of jokes that you're telling. It's also true that oftentimes people see things in us that we don't see in ourselves that are really worthwhile. Sometimes other people see things in us like loyalty or diligence or any one of a number of qualities that we wouldn't necessarily ascribe to ourselves, but the people around us see in us. And I think it's one of the reasons that I like giving this assignment, and the reason that I would encourage you to think about actually trying to do some version of it. Really do. Try to write down 3 words that you would use to describe yourself, and then find 3 people and ask them to do something similar for you. It is, like I say, the instinct is that you would approach this with like a little bit of fear, that you would try to do it to avoid harm, avoid an impression of yourself that other people didn't have, that led you astray or into trouble. But the reality of this assignment is the way that it works out for most people is they discover something about themselves that they hadn't thought of as a definitional attribute. And that really is that if all of these people see you as as loyal or kind, that it really is, it's an important thing to know about yourself, and it can be a fun thing to discover. It can be a fun, a fun exploration to really think about embodying and filling out the qualities in ourselves that other people see that maybe we don't necessarily think of, that aren't conscious, but that are really definitional and really big parts of who we are. And figuring out again how to amplify those and use those qualities and those attributes in the ways that are to our best advantage is an important part of intelligently managing your image and developing a brand story that you're in charge of, that you get to tell, as well as participate in. Now, it's also true that as you get to know yourself and your story, one of the places that people will encounter you before you ever get a chance to do an in-person interaction is online in the digital space. So it's important that you Google yourself. And this is akin to looking in the mirror before you go on stage to give a presentation, or checking yourself in the mirror before you leave the house in the morning. It's not an exercise in vanity or narcissism unless it devolves into that. But what it is about is knowing how you present to other people, that there's no other way to see the eyelash that's on your cheek than to look in a mirror, that it's not something you're going to feel there on your own. And the same is true with the digital space, that you want to have some idea of how you present in that space. The tip here is to use a friend's computer or a public computer, or a computer that isn't one that you use regularly. Google will weight search results based on your search history if they know that it's you sitting behind the computer doing it. So when I search myself, I get all the best etiquette results you ever saw in your life. If I search for myself as a generic user, I get a very different set of results. In fact, one of the highest results that comes up on my image pages are pictures from my wedding. Now, that is a very different impression that a potential client gets doing an image search of me than I would get of myself if I did an image search of myself. So identify a way to see yourself the way a generic user or a user that doesn't have your search history would see you, because that's the way people are going to be meeting you in the online space. Again, it's not about reputation defender services or trying to manipulate or change your online image as much as knowing what it is that people see there. You can always reach out to people, ask them to take down stuff that you don't like. And the other positive suggestion that I can give for managing image in this space is to set up a LinkedIn profile for yourself. Once upon a time, the idea was that it was like an online resume, that you used it for job searches, and you wanted to be careful about not being too active in that space if you weren't actively looking for a job. That is not true any longer. LinkedIn is the very active professional networking, social network, and many, many, many people use it like an online business card as well as an online resume. So it plays well with Google. Set up a LinkedIn profile with your name spelled the way that you share it on your business materials with a professional headshot. You'll have gone a long way towards establishing a professional image for yourself in the digital or online space. Now, LinkedIn is the social network that plays well with Google. The other social networks don't play as well with Google. And they're another place where people will get impressions of you online. The big picture etiquette message for the social messaging space is that ultimately, because you're not required to participate, because you're choosing to participate, you're also responsible for everything that you do there. The impressions that that your participation and activity in that space create are valid impressions. And just to stay aware of that, that it's potentially one of the most public and permanent places that we operate, that everything we do in the digital world has a digital signature that connects it back to us. And that no matter how private that space can feel, either in terms of the individuals we're interacting with on those devices or the spaces where we interact with those devices, that everything you do in the online space is potentially available to someone with just one level of technical knowledge higher than your own. And the examples of this are just too numerous to even include. There's always one that is more recent, that is more torn from the headlines than any of the examples that I can give you. But take responsibility for what you do in those spaces. When we talk about conversation skills in just a minute, we're going to talk about using those conversation skills to moderate participation in social media spaces. So this is where I'm going to give you a broad homework assignment. Now, if we were sitting in a classroom together, we would go through each of three areas: your appearance, your actions, and your words, as areas to target for small improvements. I don't know what's going to be in fashion in the industry that you choose to work in next. I don't know what size the shoulder pads and the jackets are going to be fashionable next year, which colors, which fabrics. I do know that if you pay attention to your appearance, it will show and people will notice. I also know that the people that are the best at this are the people that continue to work at this, that there is always room for improvement. In fact, the room for improvement is the greatest when you just get started. The gains that you make between yoga classes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are just phenomenal. Whereas the gains that you make between yoga classes 65, 66, and 67 are smaller. They're more incremental. And the same is true when you're making gains on your image. But that doesn't mean that you don't keep doing it. In fact, the people that are the best are the ones that stick with it. So narrow your focus. Target each of three areas: your appearance. So that's image and attire, personal grooming, and hygiene. That person on your image team that you're the closest to, you can ask them to help you do a personal grooming and hygiene assessment. Our habits, routines, and patterns change over a life, as do our bodies. It's important to do a grooming and hygiene assessment with the help of someone else periodically, once every couple of years, just to be sure you're not missing anything. A new hat that you wear in the winter that results in some dandruff that you didn't have the winter before that now shows up when you put on a dark jacket. It doesn't mean that you don't care. It doesn't mean that you weren't well raised. It's just an acknowledgement that you're not going to smell your own bad breath or your own body odor, that there are certain things that an external eye can be really helpful with. And personal hygiene and grooming issues are things that you really don't want to bring into the professional space if you can avoid it. And this is one of the ways that you can avoid it. So appearance, thinking about both your wardrobe as well as hygiene and grooming routines. Actions. I'm not talking about big actions. I'm talking about posture, gesture, eye contact, nervous habits, tapping toes, cracking knuckles, clicking pens, the inability to make or sustain eye contact, the inability to stay present and open with outwardly rotated shoulders and hips, so that you're not always retreating, you're not always deflecting, looking away from people, unable to face people, closed off with shoulders inwardly rotated and arms or limbs crossed in front of you. When I'm talking about actions, that's the posture and gestural vocabulary that I'm talking about. And it's another place where that person who's the closest to you can be a help. We're not always aware of our nervous habits, cracking knuckles, clicking pens, tapping toes. If there are things like that that you are aware of, it's a good time to start thinking about ways that you might start to change or reprocess some of those habits in ways that are more useful to you or that you're in more control of. And finally is your words. And your voice is also part of your image. I have the great misfortune of recording a podcast every week that I have to listen to. So I have to hear my own voice on a weekly basis. But if it's been more than a year or two since you've heard your own voice, most of us have a voice memo app on that phone that we carry with us. The next time you're on a business call or in a meeting, or even if you're just sitting talking with friends, maybe record your part of the conversation and listen back later just to hear what you sound like, the tone and timbre of your voice. Pause, inflection, how your voice rises and falls. Is there nervous laughter that creeps in certain situations? Are there spacer or filler words that start to impact your speech? Is an accent affecting your ability to be understood? An accent can be charming, disarming, it can be part of someone's charm and identity. It can also be an impediment to being understood clearly. So you want to really think actively about how your voice is part of your image. And if there are places where you would like to make improvements, this is a great time to give yourself a small assignment. And maybe it's just that you're going to reduce the number of ums in your speech, or maybe it's that you're going to slow down a little bit and try to pause more, or it can be any of a number of things. But what I'm going to encourage is that you give yourself a small actionable assignment in each of these areas, a small tangible change that you could make in your appearance, something that you could work on in your actions, and something you could work on with your words or your voice as well. Ultimately, this is an opportunity. I'm not going to come back and check up on you in a year, but I will tell you that if you, over the course of the next year, make small incremental changes in each of 3 areas, and over the course of that time, you improve your external appearance, it's going to materially improve your professional relationships with people around you. Choosing to dress within the guidelines of our workplace or within the standards of our community is just a statement about conformity. It's also a statement about respect and cohesion with the people around us. It's an important way to show that we're connected and that we value those relationships. So that's the end of the personal image assessment component of the talk. Now we're going to really start to think about how we engage with other people. And if you think about where relationships begin, they often start with first impressions and first meetings. And all of the old cliches are true, and we say them over and over again because they're true, and they start to lose some of their meaning. But at the same time, they remain true. First impressions can make or break you. How you handle yourself says a great deal about you, and you never get a second chance to make that first impression. Here's another truth about first impressions. People are going to judge you almost instantaneously on things that you have very little control over. Things like how rapidly your irises dilate in response to certain emotional cues they're giving you, how tall you are, how symmetrical your face is. The way that you choose to introduce yourself gives you an opportunity. It gives you an opportunity to wrest some control of that first impression. Now, you can't take it over completely, but you can put your spin on it. And I'm going to strongly suggest that you do. Hi, I'm Dan Post Senning from the Emily Post Institute. It's a pleasure to meet you. I know who I'm from. I know who I am, I know where I'm from, and I know what I'm doing. I've communicated a lot very quickly with a very simple stand up, look them in the eye, open visage, smile on your face, if it's an appropriate situation for it, and it almost always was until just a couple of years ago, you offer your hand in a handshake. I do it as if you could shake my hand through the computer because a handshake is such a fundamentally important part of a self-introduction. It is one of the only opportunities that we have to physically touch someone else in a professional situation or in a more formal setting. It is a prescribed gesture that says, I come in peace, I come in friendship, I present you my hand with no weapon, I show you my face so you know who I am, I make eye contact with you, and I smile to show you my good intentions. It's a universal gesture of peace and friendship that is hundreds of years old. And our ability to leverage it and use it is one that I would strongly recommend everyone think about. It can be a gesture of warmth, it can be a gesture of friendship, as well as a gesture of formality. Now, everyone watching this could probably give me the bullet list of things to think about for a handshake. You want to stand up, you want to look them in the eye and smile, use a firm grip. About the same pressure you would use to turn a doorknob is a good thing to think about. Most people know not to do the bone crusher anymore, but the more common offender is the thumb and forefinger sort of too weak handshake. Nice firm grip, meet web to web, hand extended about 18 inches in front of you. In the vertical plane, you meet palm to palm, thumbs interlock, web to web, about the same pressure you'd use to turn a doorknob. What happens if it starts going on a little long? That's okay, let go. They're probably thinking the same thing. They're not going to hang on once you start to let go. And finally, you say your name and repeat their name when it's offered. Ultimately, it's about establishing a relationship. So you want to make that eye contact, make that smile, offer your hand. If for some reason you can't shake hands or you're not shaking hands, trust your words to say the things that the gesture would otherwise say. Stand, look them in the eye, smile, say it's such a pleasure to meet you. If there's a reason that you're not shaking hands, you can always say what that is. But you can also say it's such a pleasure to be with you in person. It's so nice to spend this time with you. Use your words to say the things that the gesture would communicate on your behalf. Confidence is key. It's really important. This is about meeting someone. Remember, know yourself. This isn't the Hamlet moment to question your own identity. This is the Polonius moment. To thine own self be true. Represent yourself as who you are and present that clearly so that other people know how to respond to you and know how to think about you. So sometimes you're introducing yourself, but there's another very important etiquette. It's one of the most fundamental social skills. In fact, it was the original social networking skill, and that's how to introduce people to each other. And every time you introduce two people that don't know each other, you build a triangle relationship that includes you. This really is the way that you can develop large and complex social networks, even if you're not so great in that online social media space. So there are lots of different ways to think about it, but I like to suggest that you just start off by talking to the person who's more important or the person that you would like to honor. Now, in most situations, this is going to be a guest, a visitor, or an outsider. So even if you're introducing someone who's very senior to you, if you're introducing the guest, you're going to start with the guest, someone coming from outside the organization. Mr. Guest, I'd like to introduce our senior account representative, Tom Smith, to you. You can use whatever titles or names are appropriate. So Mr. Guest, Tom Smith. You can let the two people involved decide if they want to offer each other more informal names at some point later on. But when you're making that original introduction, you want to use titles and full names, whichever is most appropriate for the situation, starting with a guest, a visitor, or an outsider. If there isn't someone who's obviously the visitor or the guest, then you're going to go with an organizational hierarchy. So in that case, you would start by addressing a president and then introduce the vice president to them. If there isn't an organizational hierarchy that applies, you're going to go with age first. Respect your elders. If there's someone who's obviously senior to other people in the room, you're going to begin with them. Informally, that to you is often going to end up drifting up into the middle of the sentence. Mr. Guest, I'd like to introduce our senior account representative to you, our senior account representative, Tom Smith, to you. Or Mr. Guest, I'd like to introduce you to our senior account representative, Tom Smith. That is the way it rolls off the tongue for a lot of people. Technically, you've inverted the order of introduction when you do that. Don't worry about it. As long as you can remember to address and speak to the person that you want to honor first, you're 97% of the way there. And the vast majority of people are going to read that as polite. If you can then remember to hold the to you till the end of the introductory sentence, you'll have the order of introduction technically correct by the standards that existed 100 years ago when people were presented to each other and we didn't even use the word introduce. But technically, you'll have that order of introduction correct if you can hold that to you till the end of the sentence. If none of that made sense to you, don't worry about it. Just start by addressing the person that you want to honor first. Now, informally, it might sound something like, Grandma, I'd like to introduce you to my friend Sally from dance class. Sally, this is my grandmother, Mrs. Post. Now, I did a little bonus points on this introduction by including just a little bit of information to seed the conversation that might follow if I need to run off and greet the next friend that's arriving to the party that I'm going to bring over to meet Grandma or something like that. So now I've run off and Grandma can say, oh, hi, Susan. I know Dan loves that dance class. Do you love it as much as he does? And Susan can say, oh, I really do, Mrs. Post. Have you always been his grandma? And that's the bad joke that always gets groans from the crowd when I tell it. And then I say, maybe it's time I look at my own humor in my own image assessment. But what I like about that example also is that I can address grandma as grandma, but when I'm introducing her to my friend, I've got to tell her that it's Mrs. Post because that's what the friend is going to be calling my grandmother. So she needs to know that full name and title. The bonus points for the conversation for seeding the conversation that might follow is another important art to start to bring into your good etiquette as well. Now, a question that often comes up at this time is about traditional gendered courtesies. Can men approach women, introduce themselves? Can women approach men? Absolutely. In business, it is an absolutely rock solid standard that business etiquette is gender neutral. You never say or do something with a member of one gender that you wouldn't say or do with a member of another. If this starts to impose some conflict on you, if there are traditional courtesies that are traditional gendered courtesies that matter a lot to you, that are a big part of how you operate or how you like to operate, you can always ask permission to perform the courtesy. Oh, could I get that chair for you? Thank you so much, young man or young woman. It's been 15 years since someone offered to hold a chair for me. That's quite all right. I've got it myself. It could be another answer. You've now asked permission to provide the courtesy. You've given them the option of either participating or not. And I think it's something that is really worth keeping in mind. It's a way to continue to leverage these courtesies in ways that allow people to feel good about them, and not feel like they're being imposed on anybody. Ultimately, it's not about men being courteous to women, it's about people being courteous to people. That one of the challenges that I like to offer everyone is to think about how a traditional gendered courtesy would apply in a world where business etiquette was gender neutral. If it is anathema to you that you would stay seated at a table when a woman approached to join you at the table, what if you took the same approach with a man that approached the table? What if anytime someone joined your small lunch group, you stood up to welcome them to the table? Or if you used the formality of the meal and the lunch itself to determine whether you were going to stand as people arrived and left, rather than the gender of the person who was approaching or leaving. So another way that you might approach the application of traditional gendered courtesies is to think about non-gendered applications of them. Anyone can hold a door for anyone. Anyone could theoretically hold a chair for anyone. There are lots of ways that these courtesies can be carried forward in ways that continue to let people feel really good, both on the offering and receiving ends. The challenge that I like to leave everyone with is to think about what chivalry really looks like today. That if the chivalric code was about people who had a lot of power, authority, and agency, showing consideration and respect to people who didn't have as much power, authority, or agency. If it was that power differential between the parties involved that made the show of respect so significant and so important in the world that chivalry and the chivalric code emerged out of, what does that mean today? What does chivalry look like in today's world? Who are the people that have the most power and control and authority, and who are the people that have the least? And what would we do if we found ourselves in positions of power and control authority to show respect and consideration for people that don't have those in the same abundance or don't have them to the same level or degree that we do? To me, that's the heart of chivalry, and it's why it's so appealing as a concept. I think it's why I think it's why it's something that people hold so dear, because there's something really special about the concept. And I think that is well worth investigating and well worth carrying forward with us into the world of contemporary manners today, and hopefully into the future as well. So once we've been introduced, or once we've successfully introduced ourselves, hopefully that is the entree into a conversation. Now, when we think about conversation skills, one of the first things that jumps to mind is, what do I say? What do I say? What do I say? Well, the first job that I want us to think about in a conversation is listening, and active listening. And that's not just listening where you take the information in and process it and retain it, but active listening shows someone else that you're listening. So you could be successfully listening to this talk, and I have no idea of how you're responding to it. There are no signals or cues that you need to be giving me. But if this was a live event, and I've done a lot of live webinars as well as a lot of recorded ones, the difference between someone turning on their screen and responding to me while I'm talking versus just talking without getting any of that response, just getting black screens, is remarkable. And to me, it's one of the best illustrations of why active listening is so important. When someone's sitting across the table from you, they could be sitting there with a neutral blank slate and hearing everything that you say, retaining everything that you say, but giving no indication of it. And it could be a deeply unsatisfying, even unsettling experience for the person speaking. A good active listener knows how to show people that they're listening. In a one-on-one conversation, shared evenly, 50% of the time you're going to be listening. With 3 people, 66% of the time. Definitionally, in conversation, the biggest job you are going to play is that of a listener. What are our active listening skills? They begin with nonverbal cues. So that's the eye contact first. That's the slight nods and affirmations, but it's also some of those postural cues that we talked a little bit about in image and attire. Anything that inwardly rotates your shoulders or crosses your limbs in front of you starts to close you off. If you just fail to face somebody, you're less available to them. If your head is turned away, you're even more unavailable. So it's eye contact, face, body, shoulders open, shoulders on tops of hips so that you're present, you're in your upright, alert, attentive verticality. You can repeat back what you've heard. Are you telling me that if I say what someone just said, they're going to know that I've been listening to them? Yes, that's exactly what I'm telling you. It doesn't even need to be a follow-up thought. You're going to say, no, did I hear you right? Okay, I want to be sure I got that. Are you saying? Oh boy, I love to hear you say, repeat back what you've heard. Follow-up questions, when appropriate, are another great way to draw someone out into a little bit more exposition, but also to show that you've been engaged, that you've been relating to the material as well as listening to it. And finally, is my reminder to keep it up. Notice the moment in a conversation when you check out, when you've decided what it is you're going to say next, or when you're looking for your point of exit, and go back to active listening. Even if you're still looking for a point to exit the conversation, until that moment arrives, use a nonverbal cue, repeat something back, maybe ask a follow-up question if that's not going to stick you there longer, but keep it up. Try to attenuate or draw out the cycles of exertion and recuperation that you fall into, even within a conversation or a lecture format. Really try to attenuate and draw your listening skills out. Take that moment when you've noticed your mind starts to wander and use this checklist. Go back and do 1, 2, 3. Give a specific nonverbal cue, repeat something back, think of or ask a follow-up question, and then see how you're doing. Maybe even just that re-engagement alone is enough to recenter you in the conversation. Or maybe it just gives someone the impression and the real impression that you've been listening until that time when you're able to exit. So when it is your turn to talk, what do you get to say? Well, if I were to ask the same room that we did that word association with, what are the topics of conversation to avoid in polite company, I would hear religion, politics, dating, and your love life very quickly. Well, before we talk about what to avoid, I want to talk about tier 1 conversation topics, things that are safe to talk about anytime, anywhere with almost anybody. Things like sports, the weather, pop culture, or immediate shared experiences. So that would be things like the weather or the traffic in or the food that's just been served out or was delivered that morning. It can be a hobby, something that you're interested in. It can be the opera or particle physics. It doesn't need to be boring. It doesn't always need to be the overcast morning. You can talk about a lot of things without getting into potential tier 2 conversations. That's politics, religion, dating, or your love life. It's gotten harder as more people view more things through the lens of politics than before. But in general, the idea was that you were careful about these conversations because people had very valid and very different feelings about them that were very deeply held. So the reality is that whenever you're talking about any of these things, you are definitionally in a topic area where the person that you're talking to might feel both strongly and differently than you do. And just the reality of that means that we have to approach the topics with care, even if the person that we're talking to thinks things very similarly to us, and would maybe even agree with us if we actually got into it. It's not that we're not allowed to have these conversations. It's just that we approach them well and slightly differently than we do tier 1 topics. You test the waters, you wade in slowly. If someone else is uncomfortable talking about them, you're ready and willing to exit that conversation and rejoin them in a tier one conversation. So I might love talking about politics, but if the person I'm talking to is made uncomfortable by it, well, that should be enough to guide me back to tier one, where everyone can be comfortable and participate in the conversation. Now, our civic lives would cease functioning, our spiritual selves would atrophy, we would never find love if we couldn't have these conversations and have them well. But we have them with people who we've built and established rapport and trust, where we've established that these are topics that we do discuss and what the boundaries and parameters for those conversations are. So take care in public spaces, in new company. Approach the topics with your antenna out. You can always ask if people are comfortable talking, if you don't trust yourself to read their cues about these things. If someone's pursuing you, wanting to know your opinions and your interests, you can share as much as you're comfortable with, but you can also always opt not to. It's never expected that you take a stand in these areas. The final tip that I have about tier two conversations for people is that a willingness to listen to someone else is another part of the price of admission. That if these are conversations that you like to have, that you want to have, that you have to be willing to listen to someone who has a very different opinion than yours about it. And maybe even if things get argumentative or confrontational, that you might have to be willing to see the last word to gracefully exit that conversation as well. Tier three is the most intimate, the most personal. The little mnemonic for remembering it is family and finance. And you just never ask a personal or probing question about these topic areas unless someone has already opened the door. So if we're sitting in my office and I've got pictures of the kids' little league and I tell you I'm heading to coach the practice after we finish the meeting, that's me opening the door to a conversation about kids. But absent that, you never want to ask someone a question about one of these topics. They're just too personal, and the potential to offend is too great. Oh, I notice you're not drinking. Are you pregnant? Sort of the classic etiquette conversation mistake, because it crosses all those lines so instantly, so immediately, and with such obliviousness. So take extra care, both in terms of how you share about family and finance, but take extra care with how you inquire or talk with other people about their families or financial situations. If you're ever uncertain, you can always ask permission. Is it okay to ask? Are you comfortable talking about rental prices in New York? I know you've been living here for a long time. I'm new. I feel like I'm in a little over my head, and I'm curious to hear more about rent in New York. If there are good and valid reasons to have those conversations, you can ask to have them, as long as you're respectful of any answers that you get. And the care that you approach that conversation with will illustrate to someone the care that you're going to take with their very personal information or perspective. Now, these conversation concepts are really useful for moderating social media. We're going to talk about that in just a second, but I am contractually obligated as an etiquette teacher to include a magic words slide in the deck. And the first three magic words that are going to be peppered into your conversation are going to instantly make you more polite in terms of how you're perceived are please, thank you, and you're welcome. You're welcome in particular is underused. We are very familiar with hearing, oh, it was no trouble. Oh, it was no worries. Oh, it was no problem in response to thank you. And if you think about it, those minimize the thanks. They're important tools to have in our toolbox. Sometimes the response that you want to give someone is, oh, don't worry about it. It was no trouble. It made me happy to do it. We don't always want to minimize someone else's thank yous. I'm thanking you for something. You're telling me not to worry. I'm not telling you I'm worried. I'm telling you that I'm thanking you, that I appreciated the thing. And your ability and willingness to receive that thanks and acknowledge it is an important part to starting the way that gratitude functions in relationships and really cements and binds us in ways that are just so remarkable. You're welcome is a powerful, powerful magic word. And I just wanted to take an extra minute to encourage people to use it, to receive that thanks, to acknowledge and accept thanks from people in a way that allows us to participate in their gratitude. And it's just so important. So if you haven't used your welcome in a while, this is a little reminder to use your welcome the next time the opportunity presents itself. Sorry, pardon me, and excuse me are also magic words. The ways that we handle our mistakes and mishaps and potential offenses says as much about us, maybe more, than how we handle our successes. Saying sorry, taking responsibility for a mistake, indicating regret is important, but it's also important to have some lower bar um, language for excusing bad behavior or asking for forgiveness. And excuse me and pardon me are very effective for anticipating an offense and asking just a little bit of permission. One of the exercises that I love to give people is the next time you're in a crowded room, try walking through the room. Excuse me, pardon me, let those words be easy and present in your mind, and then try it again and don't let yourself say those things. I mean, don't do it if it's going to result in danger for you, but the point being that these words are magic and that they change spaces and people and dynamics, and the same action that could potentially be viewed as rude, offensive, even aggressive without an excuse me or a pardon me, with an appropriately delivered excuse me or pardon me, actually is something that's permissible, maybe even polite. So conversation leads to communication. We've exchanged our contact information. We want to pick this up again sometime, or perhaps I'm communicating in business. It's not a new relationship, but over a distance. Now, the most important thing to think about with communication over a distance is something we call the bulletin board rule. And it used to be the headline rule before you wrote it down and signed your name. Be ready for it to be the headline in the newspaper of the town where it lands. Oh, I trust the attorney who's getting it. Yeah, but do you trust the janitor that takes out their trash? Do you trust the client that's sitting in their office waiting for them to come back from lunch and sees your letter sitting on the desk? The point being, once you've signed your name to it, written it down, sent it out into the world, you've ceded some control over it. Everything that we do in the digital space has a digital signature that connects it back to us. If you can't put it on a bulletin board in a public space, either in your office or your hometown, don't email it, text it, IM it, DM it, leave it on a voicemail, post it. Anything in the digital space is potentially permanent and public. So hold yourself accountable. Think about whether or not you would take that same piece of content and put it on a bulletin board at the front of your office. Now, when we're talking about the written word, the other sort of big reminder, besides how sticky it is, how long lasting it is that they're not always great for emotional content. They're great for facts. Words are some of the most powerful tools that we have for recording information and sharing information. They are less effective for communicating emotional content. It's not that they can't, they're good, but compared to date and time and place, it's just a whole different thing entirely. In the absence of facial expression, tone of voice, interpretation will often default to the negative. Something that sounds positive to you when you write it down will oftentimes sound neutral to someone who's reading it. Something that sounds neutral when you write it down will sound negative to someone who's reading it. You want to be careful of that discrepancy between the person who generates and the person who reads. And because of that, give yourself a fighting chance. If there is emotional content to something that you're wanting to convey to someone, give yourself the best possible opportunity to succeed and visit them in person. Let them see the look on your face, the twinkle in your eye, the the frown or the sadness on your face, whatever it is. Let your person be part of the empathetic communication of that emotion to someone else. A lot of this is conveyed through the voice as well. Tone of voice, the speed, the inflection, the ways we pause, the ways that our voice rises and falls says a great deal to the people around us. It's not always possible, but if you can, give yourself a fighting chance, visit them in person. If you can't do that, pick up the phone and give them a call. If you can't do that, you can always acknowledge the limitation of the communication medium and let someone know that you look forward to connecting with them in a more personal way if you have to get into it. Now, email that gets more than 2-3 paragraphs starts to communicate to me that I'm trying to say more than just a brief information exchange, and it's probably worth putting down the keyboard and picking up the phone. Use those words for who, what, where, when, all that information that you need. Definitely don't use the written word to avoid awkward or difficult situations. So that's the text message to your boss when you're late to a meeting that you don't know if they got, you don't know if they received it. You want to be sure that you take accountability, that you check in, that you communicate through standard channels, and that you don't try to avoid that emotional connection that we were talking about being so important by using the written word, even if you anticipate that it's going to be difficult, or maybe especially if you anticipate that it's going to be difficult. Email is still the major communication tool. It is the written type of communication that most business is done at, even as social networks are becoming more and more ubiquitous as business communication tools. It really is email that is the center of most business communication. You want to be timely. We used to say, let it simmer. Don't, hit send on that angry email too quickly. But for some people, it's also about avoidance. There are as many flighters as there are fighters out there. The expected turnaround time for email is about 24 hours. If you can get it back same day, that's great. If emails can arrive in the morning, go back by the afternoon, best practice. If you tighten it up to within an hour or two, you will be everyone's favorite email correspondent. But definitely hold yourself accountable to about a 24-hour window. If it starts to get beyond that, I think it's worth acknowledging. Be careful with to and subject fields. So that's being sure that with autofills that you get things to the right people, that you use subject lines to accurately label and identify what it is that you're sending or sharing. There is an emerging courtesy in a world where we're all asked to sort and filter a lot of information on a daily basis, to tagging and categorizing information so that the people that we're interacting with can easily identify it and sort the wheat from the chaff. Be careful with reply all, CC, and BCC. That's the same thing. You don't need to include people on messages where the information isn't for them, so only use reply all when appropriate. When it comes to the carbon copy and the blind carbon copy, the idea is not to be deceptive, that if you ever BCC'd someone, that you would want to be able to tell everyone else on the list, everyone who was CC'd or everyone else who was BCC'd, the reason why that person was BCC'd. So if you're just protecting people's emails, or you're trying to keep the reply all phenomenon from impacting everyone, those are all really good, valid reasons to use the blind carbon copy. Blind carbon copying someone's boss and not telling them as a way to report on their work or hold them accountable would be deceptive uses of that BCC that can really be seen as rude. You want to proofread for grammar, word choice, and spelling. We've never had more tools at our disposal or less of an excuse to make errors in those areas. Avoid text speak creeping into email communication. There is an emerging body of research that shows emoticons can add some emotional content to written communication, particularly in established relationships. But it can also be very confusing for people that don't understand it, or where there isn't a relationship or a rapport that someone can lean on. Is LOL lots of love or laugh out loud? It's one of the most common text abbreviations, and it means different things to different people and creates very different meanings as a sign off, depending on how it's read. Be really, really careful with text speak and emoticons creeping into email communication. In general, write clearly. Let your writing say what it's intending to say. In general, we are aware not to write in all caps that is screaming. The very contemporary add-on to that is just be careful about the use of exclamation points. If you wouldn't really exclaim it in conversation, you don't want to exclaim it as a grammatical choice in an email that's ultimately designed to be read as if someone is speaking to you, written in complete sentences with correct punctuation. You want to think about familiarity and formality in your email communication. And to me, the easiest way to establish formality in the communication, or to match formality levels with other people, is to think about salutations and closings. So salutations, how you open the email; closings are how you close it. So the most formal salutation would be dear Mr. or Mrs. or Ms., first name and last name. Descending down the scale of formality, you could have dear title last name, dear last name, dear first name. You could just say hello first name, hello good morning first name. If you didn't know someone's name, just some sort of greeting, good morning or good afternoon. But the idea is that there's always some sort of salutation at the top of the email, particularly when you're opening any email chain. When I'm emailing with Lizzie Post, who I email with multiple times in a day, I still use some sort of salutation. LP for Lizzie Post, just initials, comma, return, and then the body of the email. And I've just made the effort to acknowledge someone's humanity before I get into the task share or the request or whatever it is that is the heart of the communication. If possible, acknowledge someone's humanity. It's not a huge effort to just include someone's initials or first name, comma, return before you begin that email. For closings, the most formal closing is sincerely, comma, then the name below it on the next line. For business, sincerely almost always works, but you can also use best regards, all the best. That's sort of descending down a scale of formality. For social correspondence, you have an infinite number of choices. Affectionately, yours truly, with love, with great admiration, waiting on pins and needles. It really can be quite creative. But having some sort of closing where then you sign off at the end, it gives the communication a start and a finish. It gives people mentally a point of entrance and a point of exit. It also establishes tone. Now, as the email chain starts to develop, oftentimes the reply will match the formality of the first, and then those salutations and closings will fall out as the chain develops. If you reinitiate a new email chain, even with the same person, the process starts again. That's the official courtesy around email etiquette. The biggest mistake that etiquette aficionados make with email in general is thanks built in as a closing. One of the only closings that you could get yourself in trouble with in business is thanking someone and then signing off with that and building that into a signature line. There are some emails where you're asking for work to be done and preemptively thanking can really bother some people. The other sort of element to the thanks as signature is that it can start to, if someone identifies that it happens all the time, that it's a built-in email signature that automatically populates at the bottom of a message, that it starts to sound insincere or impersonal. And that's the other thing you really want to avoid. You want to give your thanks the weight that it deserves. And if you really want to thank at the end of a message, put it up in the body of the email and then use a more traditional or even more creative closing to finish out the letter, but give that thanks the weight it deserves and put it up in the body of the email. Smartphone manners, top 7. We're going to do them really quick because the first manner is really the manner that I think is going to cascade down the list and be the most important takeaway. And that's that you want to control it. You don't want to be controlled by it. These devices are designed to ask for our attention, and then the software and the programs that we run on them are designed to hold our attention. And you want to do everything that you can to break that habit. Now, there are apps that are designed to deprogram your use of the phone. I don't recommend that. But what I do recommend is that you start to think about that feedback loop of chime, 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 interact with device, endorphin rush, because it is so habit forming that it can really start to impact relationships if you don't develop an intentional relationship to it. These devices are miraculous. I am not a Luddite. I could hold my phone up and say, this is my phone. It is not rude. It is not polite. It is how I use it that matters. They're tools. They're communication tools. And as long as we're in control of it, and as long as we're using it in service of relationships, it can be a very, very powerful tool. We just don't want to get so seduced by it that we stop being intentional with our use of it and we stop having control of our use of it. So one way to hold yourself accountable is think about the people around you. If its use could really bother others, turn it off. I'm thinking about houses of worship, religious services, funerals, graduations, movies. There are plenty of places where there is no good reason for you to anticipate interacting with the device or taking a call. And those are great moments to practice actually separating yourself from it or or turning it off in a way that it can't ask for your attention, even if it might not demand it. Use the silent ring mode and move away from others if you're in a situation where you can take a call, but you don't want to subject other people to one half of a conversation. Make an effort to move away and not have your alerts be distracting to them. Beware of telephone voice. Speak softly as you're taking these calls in more and more places. Don't make a call at your table in a restaurant or at a meeting unless you've warned others about what you're going to be using it for in advance. These are two other places where survey data shows people have a heightened expectation of others not using their cell phones. So if there's a table that you're at where a meal is being served, be really careful. If you're sitting around a table for a scheduled meeting, or frankly, if you're sitting around a Zoom conference for a scheduled meeting, be really careful about using your phone in a way that other people are witnessing. And finally, don't keep confidential information on it. It's a pain to relock and reopen these screens all the time, but if it fell out of your pocket in a taxi, could the next person sitting down in that car read your work email? It's sort of one of the little tests that is sort of a spot check for how careful you are with the confidential information on those devices. I had mentioned conversation skills as a way to moderate social media participation. And as we think about communicating in social media, if you are thinking about a tier 1 topic, I say go for it. I think there is a certain generosity of spirit participating in these networks and in these mediums. And for those that do it well and enjoy that space, I think there are a lot of rewards to be reaped. If you're thinking about a tier 2 conversation happening in a social media space or an online forum, I say keep it positive. That's my best guideline for it. That if you remember that people read the positive, interpret it neutral, people read the neutral, interpret it negative, really keep your participation positive about your own orientation. It's not going to guarantee you good outcomes. It's not going to guarantee you good actions, but I think it's going to increase the rate that you experience those things as opposed to the others. And then if it's a tier 3 topic, the advice is to wait at least a day. And usually that period of reflection provides enough of an opportunity for someone to reconsider that they're not going to do it. You might really be excited, the deal you just got on a new house, but you don't know who in your network had a tough short sale or got foreclosed on recently, because they probably wouldn't be talking about that in those public places, or they might not be talking about that in those public places. Even if you're comfortable talking about it, it says a great deal about your discretion, how you do it. And you want to be really careful with tier 3 conversations that are happening in public spaces, because it's very hard to regulate the way that conversation proceeds, and that can be very personal and private information. So this is where we're going to start to wrap our talk. And I've alluded to thank you notes as a potential skill or activity that you could commit to as a takeaway from this particular webinar that we've been experiencing together today. And I just want to encourage that thinking as much as I possibly can. This is one of those social skills. This is one of those communication skills. It's also a way of expressing gratitude that is just so effective. And it's effective in a number of ways. The whole concept of an exchange of thanks and of gratitude is one that is incredibly positive for both parties that experience it, both the party that's expressing gratitude and the person that's receiving the gratitude. With the thank you note, you get this whole added layer where the communication medium becomes part of the message. By choosing a medium that has been around for hundreds of years, you tie into the importance of gratitude and the way that it's been recognized as important for people for hundreds of years. And the medium becomes part of the message. It's also a physical, tangible thing. It's something that you touch and something that you create that then gets physically passed to someone else. So there's a very tangible connection that happens in the world of objects and things that that starts to be harder to forget. My Uncle Peter used to say, would you rather be deleted or remembered? When people would ask him, well, can I write an email thank you? And you absolutely can. In fact, let's get right into the slides. Email, phone call, or handwritten. Well, I've already been talking about it. You have options here. And because you have options, the choices that you make start to be part of the communication. I like to say email thanks for email favors, phone call thanks for phone call favors, and handwritten thanks for favors that deserve handwritten thank yous. Things that have risen to a level where we really want to say, with the way we say it as well as what we say, that this matters to us and we appreciate it. So if someone does me an email favor, I send them a little thank you email. Someone leaves something nice for me at the house, I give them a phone call and thank them for leaving it at the house. Which situations rise to the handwritten thank you note level? Well, a gift that you haven't had an opportunity to thank someone for in person is the first one. So that's the sweater that grandma knitted and sent to you that you had to write the thank you note for as a kid, or that you make your kids write the thank you note for, that your kids didn't write the thank you note for and you heard from grandma about it. The gift that's been given that you haven't had an opportunity to thank for in person is one example that you should have in your mind. A major opportunity. So this is when someone interviews you in person for a new job, or maybe a new project. A potential client is willing to consider you for something, but they've invested a significant portion of their own time and effort, and particularly if they've invested of themselves personally. If they've made an effort to interview you in person or meet with you to talk to you about a project, a handwritten thank you note is a great way to show your appreciation or thanks for that. And the other is if someone treats you to a meal in a business context. So either they take you out for a really nice meal, or even more so, if a business contact has invited you to their home for some reason and they've served you food at their home, you absolutely want to send a thank you note for that as well. So gifts that you haven't thanked for in person, major career opportunities or milestones, or someone who's gifted you or prepared a meal for you, who's usually a business contact or a relationship. Those are ones where you can kind of just default to the handwritten thank you note. It's not going to be too hard to do because you're going to keep it short. Brevity is the soul of wit. This letter would have been shorter if I had more time. 3 to 5 sentences is more than enough. If you meet with several people, yes, you should send a note to each one if there was an interview team or if there was a committee that you met with. And we've talked about when you might choose the email, phone call, or text versions as well. Now, what do those 3 to 5 sentences sound like? There is a Mad Libs version of a thank you note that I want to run through with you. If you have a version of a thank you note that you have been using successfully, or that you learned when you were young and that you're very fond of, by all means, don't let me slow you down or get in the way. But if you're looking to improve your thank you note, or it's not a regular practice for you, I want to encourage you to think about it as something that's relatively easy to do. You start by putting the date in the upper right-hand corner, either of the fold over note or the correspondence card. Dear, then their name. Dear is a lovely start. Most thank you notes you can use someone's first name for, because it is oftentimes meant to be a more personal thank you. But if not, it can be dear and their full name, or even dear and their title and full name. Comma, start the first line. First sentence, you don't have to think about anything. You just write, thank you so much for X, Y, or Z. Thank you so much for the thing. The second sentence is where you become responsible for an original thought. In fact, it's the one original thought you're responsible for in this whole process. You need to say something that personalizes the note, something that's about the connection you have with the person that you're thanking, or that's about the thing that you're thanking for, or about the effort that they put in, or the quality of the thing itself, but some sort of personal thought, something that that makes this note unique to this particular experience, that it's not a note that you could reprint and reuse next week or next year. It's something specific, and that's it. I mean, one sentence that really makes this personal and specific. A third sentence could be about a follow-up action, if appropriate or reasonable. The last sentence can be a repetition of the thanks in some form, and then you're going to use a closing, sincerely, comma, your name underneath it. But for a thank you note, you can get away with a broader range of closings. But sincerely is, I think, really nice. It's both formal and it's very genuine. It's very sincere. So what might that look like? Well, on July 19th of 2023, we wrote to Dear Mr. Jones. Thank you very much for meeting with me. I enjoyed having the opportunity to find out more about your company. I'm looking forward to working with your team. Thank you again. Sincerely, Carla Ramirez. Very quick note, doesn't take a lot of work, doesn't take a lot of effort, and it makes a huge impact when it arrives. There was a researcher at the University of Texas named Amit Kumar, and he did this incredible study where he asked people to anticipate the impact or effect that a thank you note would have when they sent it. And then they had them do the process, and then he actually went around and he found the people that had received the thank you notes, and he asked them to evaluate what the experience of receiving the thank you note was. And without fail, universally, the person who received the thank you note was left with a more positive impression of the person who sent it. They would say things like, it made me feel good. It made me think that they were very together, very organized, very thoughtful. That without fail, it raised the esteem of the person who sent the note in the eyes of the person who received it. Contrasted with the research when they asked people to anticipate the impact that the thank you note would have, a lot of people anticipated that it would be perceived as awkward, that someone would receive that thank you note, and that the awkwardness that the person felt or experienced in thinking about doing it or writing it gets projected on the person who's receiving it. Our ability to assess risk in social situations impacts our ability to actively assess the benefits of pro-social behaviors. And I will tell you that you will overestimate the risk, because there is none, that sending a thank you note will have. The first time you do it, it will feel a little awkward. If it's not a familiar habit or routine, it can feel a little strange. And it can be easy to assume that this feeling is the same feeling the person who receives it's going to have. And don't trust that feeling. That moment where you doubt yourself, I want you to remember this moment in the talk where we're very close to the end. And I say to you, no, 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 follow through, do it. Just finish writing your note, put it in the envelope, put a stamp on it, send it out the door. I guarantee that when it lands, the thought that that person's going to have is, oh, this was so thoughtful. This was so nice of this person to do. And there are very few guarantees in the etiquette world, but that is as close to one as I can give you. It's short, it's sweet, it's to the point, it's about appreciating something that someone else has done for you and making an effort to tell them and express that to them. Now, the 24/7 professional is my reminder that we live in a world that's getting smaller and smaller all the time, but it has always been a small world. Purely social situations can become business instantaneously, whether you live in the biggest city or the smallest town. You want to hold yourself accountable to professional conduct at all times. So this isn't about a mantle that we put on and take off as we move from one area of our life to the other. If we can really embrace taking care with others, behaving in a way that makes other people feel good and at ease and comfortable, that prioritizes recognizing the value and worth of others, we're going to be in pretty good shape. Ultimately, we want to use those principles of consideration, respect, and honesty in all situations, regardless of what others think. Now, it's not always about being a professional. There are some broader messages about etiquette that I really want to be sure that I also touch on before we conclude our time today. And that's the reminder that how you conduct yourself matters, that we need each other, that we live in community, and how we behave, both in terms of things that we do to acquire the things that we need and meet our essential needs, are important. But it's also fundamentally important how our behavior impacts the people around us, because ultimately, those are the people that we will live with. Cultivate an awareness of and care for others. Ultimately, etiquette isn't something you know, it's something you practice. And I think this is one of the most important things that you can remember. That I can know how to write a good thank you note, but if I don't do it periodically, I don't have great etiquette. Knowing how to do it isn't enough. It's how we practice it, how we do it with others, how we live it every day. The practice of etiquette is where it really becomes fundamentally transformational for people. and become something that really has value, that isn't something that's just known, something that's stuffy, outdated, old fashioned, but something that's alive, something that's special, and something that's respectful. I will leave you with the top 10 business etiquette behaviors, and there is a resource guide that includes the deck for today's talk, as well as a business dining and attire guide that is available to everyone who's watched the talk. It will also include a top 10 manners tips for business etiquette as well as dining. I think human attention is a gift, and I appreciate the gift of attention that you've given me and this program. I wish you great success in your future endeavors. And again, I invite you to please be in contact anytime, emilypost.com. We're always here promoting etiquette and civility in America, and we're here to support you as you think about your professional journey. Take good care.